Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling the big story of the 17th century, how North America became this contested zone. We're zeroing in on Chapter 2, basically 1500 to 1664, when the French, Dutch, and English really started challenging Spain's grip.
Exactly. And it's important to remember, by 1600, this wasn't some empty wilderness. The New World was already deeply changed. European crops, animals, devastating diseases. Spain was entrenched from Florida down to New Mexico. Plus, they'd already brought hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans, especially to the Caribbean and Brazil.
Right, Spain had nearly a century's head start, so what really signals that their dominance is ending? The sources point to this really striking moment, like 3 settlements popping up almost simultaneously. You've got the English at Jamestown in 1607, the French founding Quebec in 1608, and then the Spanish making Santa Fe official in 1610.
Yeah, it's like the starting gunfires for this new phase of competition. Different powers, different goals, gold, furs, land, it's all kicking off.
Okay, let's start with France. Why were they kind of late getting into the empire game?
Well, the 1500s were really rough for France. They were bogged down with foreign wars and, maybe more importantly, intense internal religious conflict. We're talking Catholics versus Protestant Huguenots. It got incredibly violent, like the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Just brutal.
So they couldn't really focus overseas until that settled down.
Pretty much. The turning point was the Edict of Nantes in 1598. It gave Protestants some limited rights, ended the worst of the religious wars, and finally freed France up to think about empire building under kings like Louis XIV later on. And that really starts with Samuel de Champlain.
Ah, Champlain, the father of New France. He founded Quebec in 1608, right? Like this strong point on the St. Lawrence River. The book mentions his diplomacy with Native Americans was, well, more respectful than the Spanish approach. Seems smart.
It was, in theory, but it led to a huge strategic misstep almost immediately. Champlain allied with the Huron tribes near Quebec, okay, fine, but then he joined them in a battle against their enemies, the powerful Iroquois Confederacy. The French muskets, these lightning sticks, terrified the Iroquois and won the battle easily. But
What happened?
France earned the permanent hatred of the Iroquois. We're talking lasting enmity.
Just from that one battle. Wow. So those couple of shots basically bought France decades, maybe a century of conflict.
That's about the size of it. The Iroquois blocked French expansion south, especially into the Ohio Valley, and often sided with the British later on, a massive long-term consequence. Meanwhile, New France itself, it wasn't exactly booming. It was run very autocratically from Paris. No local assemblies, no trial by jury like the English colonies would have.
And the population stayed small.
Very small. Only about 60,000 white settlers by 1750. French peasants didn't have much reason to leave home, and crucially, the Huguenots, the Protestants who might have wanted to emigrate for religious freedom, were forbidden from settling there.
So if they couldn't get lots of settlers, what was the focus?
Trade. Specifically, the beaver fur trade. That was the economic engine. European fashion demanded beaver pelts. This brings in those legendary figures, the coureurs de bois, runners of the woods, and the voyageurs.
Right. The guys in canoes paddling all over the interior.
Exactly. They were tough, adventurous traders who mapped vast territories. You see their legacy in place names today: Baton Rouge, Des Moines, Terre Haute, Grand Teton. But their trade had a dark side. It spread European diseases, introduced alcohol, which was devastating, and ecologically it nearly wiped out the beaver in many areas. It also disrupted Native American societies and beliefs pretty profoundly.
So France is spreading out, but thinly. It wasn't just traders, though.
No, you also had imperial agents trying to stake claims. Jesuit missionaries, for instance. They didn't make many converts, honestly, but they were incredibly important as explorers, geographers, map makers. Then you get figures like Antoine Cadillac founding Detroit in 1701, basically to block the English from moving into the Ohio Valley.
And La Salle's big journey down the Mississippi.
A huge one. Robert de La Salle reaches the Gulf of Mexico in 1682, claims that whole enormous river basin for Louis XIV, names it Louisiana. Later, New Orleans is founded in 1718 as a key strategic port to control the river mouth. The big takeaway for the French, though, their whole model depended on trade alliances and needing Native Americans as partners because they just didn't have the numbers for conquest and settlement like the English did.
Which brings us back to Spain, looming in the background. Before France and England really got going, Spain had nearly a century of dominance, right? Pulling out massive amounts of gold and silver.
Immense wealth. So much, in fact, that it actually caused rampant inflation back in Spain. They'd established the first permanent European town in North America way back in 1565 at St. Augustine, Florida, and Santa Fe in 1610 anchored their northern colony of New Mexico, focused heavily on missions.
Okay, so Spain's established, France is trading. What about England? They seem like the slowest starters.
They were. Initially, England and Spain were actually allies. Things changed dramatically with the Protestant Reformation, started by Henry VIII in the 1530s. When his daughter, the Protestant Queen Elizabeth I, took the throne in 1558, the rivalry with Catholic Spain really heated up.
And you mentioned this impacted how they viewed natives.
Absolutely. There's a direct link shown between how England treated the Irish and how they later treated Native Americans. English soldiers involved in brutally putting down Catholic uprisings in Ireland in the 1570s and 80s developed this real contempt for the native Irish, calling them savages. They brought that exact attitude, that prejudice, with them to the New World. It shaped their interactions from the start.
That's grim. And this anti-Spanish feeling also fueled things like piracy.
Oh, yeah. Queen Elizabeth actively encouraged her sea dogs, guys like Sir Francis Drake, to raid Spanish ships and settlements. Drake's circumnavigation voyage came back loaded with Spanish treasure, netting a massive profit for his investors, including the Queen herself. But England's first actual attempts to plant colonies were failures. Sir Humphrey Gilbert died at sea. Sir Walter Raleigh's Roanoke colony just vanished. The famous lost colony.
Right. So what changed? How did England finally get colonization to stick?
The pivotal moment was 1588, the defeat of the Spanish Armada.
Ah, the big naval battle.
Huge. England's smaller, faster ships, combined with a massive storm, they called it the Protestant wind, shattered the Spanish fleet. Didn't destroy Spain overnight, but it broke their naval dominance, boosted English morale massively, and really opened the doors psychologically and militarily for England to challenge Spain overseas. It kicked off a kind of golden age of national spirit in England.
Okay, so the will was there. What about the means? Why was England ready to colonize then?
Several factors came together. First, England's population was booming, creating social and economic pressure. At the same time, the enclosure movement was fencing off common lands for sheep grazing, pushing tons of small farmers off the land. This created a large pool of unemployed, often desperate people, particularly in wool-producing areas with Puritan leanings.
So people needed somewhere to go.
Exactly. Plus, peace with Spain was finally signed in 1604, freeing up resources and manpower. You had motives like unemployment, the desire for adventure, finding new markets, maybe even religious freedom for some. And critically, they developed the joint stock company.
Like the Virginia Company.
Precisely. These companies allowed investors to pool capital but limit their individual risk. Funding colonies was incredibly expensive and risky, so this financial tool was essential.
Which leads us directly to Jamestown. 1606, King James I charters the Virginia Company. Goals: find gold, find a passage to the Indies. And the charter included that really important line guaranteeing settlers the rights of Englishmen.
Yeah, that guarantee is fascinating. It suggests they saw this as an extension of England, not just some foreign outpost. But how did that promise hold up against the reality on the ground?
Not well, initially. Jamestown, founded in 1607, was a disaster waiting to happen. They picked a swampy, malarial location on the James River. The first 100 or so settlers were all men, and many were gentlemen, apparently unaccustomed to work, who just searched for non-existent gold instead of, farming.
So they starved.
They starved. Disease, malnutrition, starvation. The starving time winter of 1609-1610 was horrific. Out of hundreds who'd arrived, only about 60 survived. It was utter misery.
So how did the colony even survive that?
Basically, Captain John Smith. He took charge and imposed discipline with his famous rule. He who shall not work shall not eat. He forced them to organize and farm.
His relationship with the local Powhatan Confederacy was tense, though. There's the famous story of Pocahontas supposedly saving him during a mock execution staged by her father, Chief Powhatan. It was likely a ritual to show Powhatan's power and desire for peace on his terms. Pocahontas did help the starving colonists with food sometimes.
But that peace didn't last long.
No. Things got much worse when Lord de la Warr arrived in 1610. He was a new governor who brought reinforcements but also imposed a harsh military regime. And crucially, he brought those Irish tactics we talked about, declaring outright war, raiding villages, burning houses and cornfields, confiscating provisions, really brutal stuff.
So this kicked off actual wars.
Yes, the First Anglo-Powhatan War. It ended temporarily in 1614 with a fragile peace sealed by the marriage of Pocahontas to one of the colonists, John Rolfe, the guy who perfected tobacco cultivation. But tensions remained high, leading to a second major conflict in 1644. The Indians made one last major effort to drive the Virginians out, but were defeated again.
And the outcome of that second war?
The peace treaty of 1646 was decisive. It effectively banished the Chesapeake Indians from their ancestral lands, formally separating them from white settlement areas. It set a pattern for pushing Native Americans westward that would repeat again and again.
A pattern of segregation and removal, basically.
Exactly. And the book sums up the Powhatan's fate with what it calls the 3 Ds, disease. European illnesses wiped out huge numbers. Disorganization. The Powhatan Confederacy wasn't unified enough to consistently fight the English military machine. And the third D is maybe the most chilling. Disposability?
Disposability, meaning what?
Meaning, unlike in Spanish colonies where native labor was exploited, the English in Virginia found the Powhatan served no economic purpose for them once they could grow their own food, especially tobacco. The Powhatans didn't provide labor, they didn't have gold the English wanted, so the only thing the English desired was their land. The people themselves were seen as disposable obstacles.
A stark contrast to the French reliance on native partners for the fur trade.
Completely different models. Okay, before we wrap up England's start, let's quickly touch on the Dutch.
Right, the Netherlands. They had their golden age in the 17th century after gaining independence from Spain. Their main focus was the East Indies trade, right?
Mostly, yes. The Dutch East India Company was incredibly powerful, but they also dipped their toes in North America. Henry Hudson, an Englishman sailing for the Dutch, explored the Hudson River area in 1609. A bit later, the Dutch West India Company set up New Netherland, around 1623-24. Like the French, their main interest was the quick profits from the fur trade.
And they founded New Amsterdam.
Yes, which became New York City. It started as a company town run by the Dutch West India Company for its stockholders. So not much democracy or religious freedom initially. They famously bought Manhattan Island from local Native Americans for a small amount of trade goods, axes, kettles, cloth, that defensive wall they built against Indians nearby. That's the origin of Wall Street.
Interesting. And it wasn't just a trading post.
No, it had this strong aristocratic flavor, too. They granted huge feudal estates called patroonships along the Hudson River to promoters who agreed to settle 50 people on them. Some of these estates were massive, larger than Rhode Island later became.
So big estates, but maybe not that many people overall.
Compared to English colonies, no. But New Amsterdam itself became remarkably cosmopolitan, very diverse for its time. One visitor in the 1640s counted 18 different languages being spoken there. It attracted refugees, including a group of Sephardic Jews arriving in 1654.
Sounds like a preview of modern New York. Did they get along with their neighbors?
Not always. There was friction with local Indian tribes, sometimes escalating to violence, and they constantly rubbed up against their English neighbors, especially nearby Connecticut. They also had to deal with a small Swedish colony, New Sweden, planted on the Delaware River.
Swedes, too. How did that end?
The rather autocratic Dutch governor, Peter Stuyvesant, they called him, Father Woodenleg, because of his peg leg, led a military expedition in 1655 and absorbed the Swedish settlement into New Netherland. Stuyvesant was tough, but his own time was running out.
Because the English wanted the territory.
Yep. In 1664, England was asserting its power. An English naval squadron sailed into the harbor at New Amsterdam. Stuyvesant wanted to fight, but the colonists had little appetite for it, and he was forced to surrender without a single shot fired.
Just like that.
Just like that. England took over, King Charles II granted the area to his brother, the Duke of York, and New Netherland became New York. But the Dutch left their mark, place names like Harlem, Brooklyn, architecture like the gambrel roof, and even customs like Santa Claus, waffles, bowling. Those traces remain.
Okay, so we've seen the French, the Spanish lingering, the English digging in, the Dutch popping up and then getting absorbed. What was the bigger impact of all this on the original inhabitants, the Native Americans?
Profound and devastating. It created what the text calls the Indians' New World, a world utterly transformed, often shattered, by the European presence. Disease was the #1 catastrophe. Smallpox, measles. These wiped out possibly 90% of the native population in some areas, destroying cultures, erasing traditions passed down orally by elders. Groups had to merge, reinvent themselves, like the Catawba Nation formed from remnants of different peoples.
Beyond disease, what were the biggest changes?
Trade goods revolutionized life. Horses, spreading from the Spanish Southwest, allowed tribes like the Lakota Sioux to move onto the Great Plains and become nomadic buffalo hunters, a whole new way of life. But firearms, guns changed everything too. They dramatically increased the intensity of warfare between tribes, often competing for hunting grounds to get furs to trade for more European goods, including more guns. It created this destructive cycle.
And amidst all this disruption, some native groups managed to adapt and wield power, right? Like the Iroquois.
Absolutely. The Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois Confederacy, originally the Five Nations.
Mm.
Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas were a major force. They had a sophisticated political and military alliance located strategically in what's now upstate New York.
What was unique about their society?
They lived in longhouses, and their society was matrilineal. Descent and possessions passed through the female line. Women, especially the older matriarchs, held significant political and social power. Men moved into their wife's family longhouse upon marriage.
And their strategy in dealing with the Europeans.
Very shrewd for a long time. They managed to play the French and the English, and later the Dutch, off against each other. They controlled the crucial fur trade routes between the Great Lakes and the coast, becoming a key intermediary power that both European empires had to deal with.
But eventually, even their power declined.
Sadly, yes. The relentless pressures of disease, the introduction of alcohol, whiskey, and the escalating arms race eventually took their toll. The biggest blow came during the American Revolution, which split the Confederacy. Most sided with the British, and after the British defeat, the Iroquois were severely weakened and eventually confined to reservations. But their culture persisted, finding new life through things like the Longhouse religion, inspired by the prophet Handsome Lake around 1799, which still exists today.
Okay, so let's try to pull this together. We look at this early period, roughly 1600 to 1664. What are the main takeaways for you listening to this? It seems like you see three very different approaches playing out. Spain, still focused on extracting mineral wealth and controlling territory through missions. France, building a vast but sparsely populated empire based on the fur trade and needing native alliances.
And then England, particularly in the Chesapeake with Jamestown, focused intensely on settlement, on acquiring land, and developing an agricultural economy, initially with tobacco, and showing a willingness early on to displace or eliminate native populations who stood in the way of that land acquisition.
Right, those initial choices about how to use the land, who provided the labor, how to relate to the native peoples, really set the foundation for everything that followed. The conflicts, the societies that developed, it all stems from these early decisions.
And that English attitude, that contempt for savages, first seen in Ireland and then brought to Virginia, it had profound consequences, didn't it?
Definitely. Which leads to our final thought for you to consider. We saw how that English attitude led to the idea of the Powhatans being disposable. So thinking about that, how might the French, witnessing the English approach in Virginia, have viewed the long-term prospects of their strategy in the Great Lakes, that reliance on trade and alliances, the so-called middle ground? Was one approach inherently more sustainable than the other in the face of European expansion?
Something to chew on. The clash of these imperial visions was just getting started.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into a really pivotal moment in North American history.